Dear friends, welcome to E-Pathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today, we are going to look at a module called Gramcian Intervention, Hegemony and Domination in the paper called Political Sociology. Gramsci is very famous for his work called Prison Diaries. We all know that Gramsci was imprisoned during Mussolini's time, and the major part of his theorization was done in prison. His work on hegemony and on domination, his work on the tactics to bring about a revolution was also very famous. The most important theory that Antonio Gramsci brings out, which is a Marxist theory, is the importance of the superstructure, which he believed that the orthodox Marxists lost out on. And he believes that it is ideology that is the most important factor that comes into play, especially during class oppression. Multiple interpretations of Gramsci. Before we begin to sketch Gramsci's contribution to Marxist theory and on thinking about power, it has to be acknowledged that there are multiple contradictory interpretations of his work linked to the political line of those who claimed or disclaimed him. Some Gramscian scholars like Richard Bellamy argue that Gramsci's work has been misinterpreted as a general theory of ideological power in Western democracies, and argues for historicizing Gramsci. For Bellamy, Gramsci was reinvented by the Euro-communist movement of the 1970s as a Marxist Democrat whose work offered a third way, falling between social democracy on one hand and totalitarian communism on the other. For Bellamy, however, Gramsci's theories evolved as a way of understanding Italy's relative backwardness and of formulating revolutionary strategies specific to the country's exceptionality. He maintains that only by returning Gramsci to the post-Risorgimento Italy can we discover his true value as an analyst of peripheral capitalist states. The problem of multiple interpretations of Gramsci is partly due to the production of Gramsci's main work, the Prison Notebooks, from where much of his concepts are derived. Antonio Gramsci's work may never have been published as he was jailed by Mussolini regime. However, his well-wishers eventually smuggled Gramsci's writings in the form of 33 books, a total of nearly 3,000 pages of tiny meticulous handwriting, and attempted to publish them. The Prison Notebooks, as many scholars like Perry Anderson point out, are a fragmentary, incomplete record of Gramsci's mental efforts over a decade, written under the watchful eye of the prison censor, reassembled years later by editors and translators. Socio-historic context of Gramsci. It is well known assertion that our ideas are a product of our age. Sociology was born to make sense of a tumultuous changes of the French and Industrial Revolution. Similarly, to understand Gramsci, we have to see the developments of his thoughts within the context of wider political developments in Italy and Europe during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Gramsci's thoughts on politics and culture were formed during a period of defeat. The crushing of workers' revolts in Europe and the failure of the Italian working class movement in its struggles with factory owners, with the Italian state and with Mussolini's fascists. Between 1918 and 1920, short-lived socialist revolutions in Germany, Austria and Hungary were suppressed with exceptional brutality. Only the Russian Revolution succeeded in forming a workers' state, and that in a country which had not reached the level of industrial development predicted by Marx as a prerequisite of socialist revolution. Elsewhere in the industrialized world, capitalist economies and parliamentary democracies retrenched themselves at least until the rise of fascism. It was the manifest durability of capitalism that directed the attention of many scholars to the study of ideology and superstructure. Gramsci's diagnosis of this defeat focused on the inability of the working class to form alliances with other subordinate groups, particularly the peasantry and the intellectuals. It was also clear to Gramsci that the revolutionary strategy adopted in Russia would not work in more mature democracies. In Russia, the political superstructure was very poorly developed, primordial, gelatinous as he puts it, and consequently there was little in the way of intermediaries between the Tsarist regime and its revolutionary opponents. The Bolsheviks did not have to win over their intermediaries and could therefore concentrate their efforts in taking control of the state. To this all-out frontal attack, Gramsci gives the name war of maneuver. He argues that such sudden transformation and lightning victories are rare. Most revolutions, Gramsci says, have to proceed via war of position, fought over a long period in the superstructure in which meanings and values become the object of struggle. This is because in underdeveloped societies there was an absence of intermediaries, but modern capitalist regimes have developed a tightly woven network of practices and institutions which guard against internal disintegration and make revolution a political and psychological impossibility. Apart from the failure of socialism in Europe and its success in Russia, Gramsci also looked deeply into the history of his own nation to see how the ruling class secured its power in modern democratic regimes. Gramsci attempted to evaluate those strategies by which different groups attempted to form hegemonic bloc in Italy's past. He held that self-rule in Italy came piecemeal through 3 wars of unification known collectively as the Resurgence. However, once Italy had established a parliamentary democracy, the policies of the right-wing moderates and left-wing Action Party were largely identical, with both parties committed to a program of industrial modernization, political reform, and imperial expansion. Gramsci saw the Risorgimento and its aftermath as a key example of how a governing power absorbs its political antagonists and institutes reforms without expanding its programs to involve full democratic participation. Over time, Italy became governed by a variety of left-right coalitions in a period known as the Transformismo, after the policy of transforming the party conflicts of the Risorgimento into a centrist consensus. While these adventures appear to have a popular and a national dimension to them, they were actually deeply inimical to the interests of the working class and agricultural labor. Based on his readings of the Italian and European history, Gramsci puts forward his theory of hegemony to explain the workings of power in advanced capitalist countries. A critique of economic determinism. Gramsci found the existing Marxist theories unable to grasp the functioning of power in modern democratic regimes and stressed the need to innovate. This is because of the economic determinism prevalent in Marxist theory, the idea that it is the base which determines the superstructure and that culture was largely an epiphenomena reducible to economic base. Gramsci questioned the notion that the economic base determines the operations of an ideological and cultural superstructure. He developed the notion of historical block to explain that base and superstructure have a dialectical or reflexive relationship. Gramsci argues that culture, politics, and economy are organized in a relationship of mutual exchange with one another, constantly circulating and shifting network of influence. To change society involves a protracted period of negotiation carried out in all the institutions of society and culture. However, it must be stressed that Gramscian intervention is not an abandonment of questions of political economy and class struggle. It is not a substitution of a kind of ideological determinism for earlier material determinism. Within his thought, ideas are generally tied to the state of productive forces within a particular epoch and are therefore historically necessary. Gramsci's intervention is not finally a form of relativism in which all struggles are equal, nor can it depart from the idea of an ongoing struggle for change by working men and women acting in concert against the organized, durable, and global system of exploitation and oppression that is capitalism. Domination and hegemony. After asserting the importance of superstructure, Gramsci then goes on to elaborate on the organization of consent in modern capitalist democracies. Gramsci challenges a simplistic opposition between domination and subordination or resistance. Instead, he recasts domination as hegemony, the process of transaction, negotiation, and compromise that takes place between ruling and subaltern groups. Gramsci separates hegemony into various regions: ideological, economic, political, and juridical. Earlier paradigms accepted the existence of a dominant ideology, essentially and monolithically bourgeoisie in its characteristics, which with varying degrees of success is imposed from without as an alien force on the subordinate classes. Gramsci recognized that social power is not a simple matter of domination, and rather than imposing their will, dominant groups within democratic societies generally govern with a good degree of consent from the people they rule, and the maintenance of that consent is dependent upon an incessant repositioning of the relationship between rulers and the ruled. Only in anticipation of moments of crisis and command, when spontaneous consent has failed, is force openly resorted to. Hegemony is a more sensitive and therefore useful critical term than domination, which fails to acknowledge the active role of subordinate people in the operation of power. Hegemony is also a process without an end. Hegemony is a reflexive process in which the values of the power bloc, subalterns, and counter-hegemonic forces are in constant state of negotiation, compromise, and change. Ideologies are thus themselves in a process, in a state of constant formation and reformation. Gramsci thus rejects the notion that power is something that can be achieved once and for all. Instead, he conceives of it as an ongoing process, operative even at those moments when a ruling class or group can no longer generate consent. For Gramsci, forming a hegemonic bloc is the key to exercising power. Thus, hegemony is a project that involves the formation of moral and intellectual consensus under the leadership of a particular social group. Hegemony also involves compromises, and that the leading group should make sacrifices of an economic corporate kind. Far from dominating its junior partners, therefore, a successful hegemonic group has to thoroughly recreate itself. It is not a question of cynically speaking on behalf of other groups' desires in order to capture their vote, or of selecting certain issues in order to appeal to a broader constituency. A truly hegemonic group or class really must make large parts of its subalterns' worldview its own. In course of this, the leading group will itself become changed, since its narrow factionalism, what Gramsci calls corporatism, has been translated into a much broader, even universal appeal. Achieving such an alliance means overcoming the mutual misunderstandings and hostilities that separate these different groups. Gramsci argues that it is necessary to surmount these deep divisions in order to form a genuinely popular national organization which can defeat fascism and achieve a transformation of society. Gramsci puts forward the concept of national popular, which involves elaborating subaltern and subordinate elements into a broader cultural and political project without dismissing the cultural distinctiveness. Looking at his own country of Italy, Gramsci argues for a construction of a national popular necessitated two linked operations. First was to answer the southern question by synthesizing the cultures of North and South, which involved abandoning any assumptions about the superiority of Italian high culture and the primitivism of the South. The second was to find currents within the culture of all the popular classes that had the potential to provide an alternate conception of the world. A cultural project, wrote Gramsci, could not be some avant-garde movement imposed upon people. Instead, it had to be rooted in the humus of popular culture as it is, with its taste and tendencies and with its moral and intellectual world, even if it is backward and conventional. Thus, the working class movement had to understand those issues that were culturally important to the peasants and make them their own. Crucially, however, this alliance is not simply a federation of factions that carry equal weight. The industrial working class lead their allies through ideological means and provide the center of any progressive movement. As Gramsci says, the Communist Party must become a modern prince in uniting the popular currents within Italian national life. Finally, Gramsci says hegemony can be of two types depending on the extent to which the hegemonic bloc is successful. First is the case of limited hegemony, where the hegemonic class has failed to genuinely adopt the interests of the popular classes and simply neutralized or decapitated them through depriving them of the leadership. The recourse to coercive and authoritarian means of enforcing a group's rule is evidence that it has failed in its attempt to construct an expansive hegemony. Second is the case of expansive hegemony, a situation in which a hegemonic group adopts the interests of its subalterns in full, and those subalterns come to live in the worldview of the hegemonic class as their own. Civil society, common sense, and intellectuals. For Gramsci, one of the key elements of any hegemonic strategy is the formation of links with existing elements of culture. To further elaborate how hegemony of ruling class is secured in modern societies, Gramsci looks to the phenomena of common sense and civil society and the role of intellectuals. Gramsci says that the key area in which we can see the working of hegemony is civil society. Civil society becomes the private network of the state through which it organizes the whole of the social reproduction, permeating all forms of organizations and mass consciousness, and provoking a diffusion of hegemony at all levels of society. In Gramsci's widest definition of the term, it is the ensemble of organisms commonly called private. Civil society includes political organizations such as the church, the school system, sports team, the media, and the family. For Gramsci, civil society is a key mechanism for the maintenance of authority, as its effectiveness lies in the way it blurs the distinction between the political authority and everyday life. It is precisely in this private realm that ruling values seem most natural and therefore unchangeable. While civil society corresponds to the function of hegemony, political society corresponds to domination. Gramsci writes that while a hegemonic bloc leads coalition groups, it dominates antagonistic groups which it tends to liquidate or to subjugate, perhaps even by armed force. If consent is organized through civil society, then coercion is the responsibility of what Gramsci calls political society. He defines political society as a set of apparatuses which legally enforce discipline on those groups who do not give their consent during a normative period, and which dominate the whole of society in periods when consent has broken down. This suggests that the cultural, economic, and political aspects of hegemony are, in the last instance, always underpinned by the threat of violence. Another integral part to the working of hegemony is the institution of common sense. Gramsci says it is indeed the folklore of philosophy, since, like philosophy, it is a way of thinking about the world that is grounded in material realities. Unlike philosophy, however, common sense is unsystematic, heterogeneous, spontaneous, incoherent, and inconsequential, chaotic aggregate of disparate conceptions that holds together Stone Age elements, the principle of advanced science and institutions of a future philosophy. Gramsci emphatically does not conceive of common sense as practical wisdom that contradicts theorizing or dogma. Instead, it is literally thought that is common to a social group or common to society as a whole. Common sense offers a deeply held guide to life, directing people to act in a certain way and ruling out other modes of behavior as unthinkable. Gramsci opposes common sense to good sense one in which working class led hegemonic bloc counteracts with. He says that a more expansively hegemonic project would attempt to disarticulate the reactionary elements of common sense from the positive strands within. Gramsci also looks at the role of intellectual in the functioning of hegemony. Gramsci distinguished between a traditional intelligentsia and organic intellectuals. Traditional intellectuals think themselves as autonomous. Gramsci thinks of them as tied to material conditions and interests. Organic intellectuals are the thinking groups which every class produces from its own ranks organically. Thus, if the working class wants to succeed in becoming hegemonic, it must also create its own intellectuals to develop a new ideology. He critiques both Lenin and Kautsky, and who emphasize the Revolutionary Party and traditional intelligentsia over their organic intellectuals of the working class. He claims that modern intellectuals were not simply talkers but practically minded directors and organizers who helped to produce hegemony by means of ideological apparatuses such as education and the media. Resistance to hegemony. The way of challenging the dominant hegemony is political activity. Gramsci proposed a distinction between two different kinds of political strategies to achieve the capitulation of the predominant hegemony and the construction of socialist society. One was the war of maneuver, consisting of frontal attack, whose main goal is winning quickly. This strategy was specially recommended for societies with a centralized and dominant state power that have failed in developing a strong hegemony within the civil society. Example, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The second was the war of position, which was a long struggle primarily across institutions of civil society. Here the socialist forces gained control through culture and ideological struggle, instead of only political and economic contest, especially suggested for the liberal democratic societies of Western capitalism with weaker states but stronger hegemonies. Gramsci also talks about the importance of crisis in breaking the hegemony of the ruling class. Crisis occurs either because the ruling class has failed in some major political undertaking for which it has requested, or forcibly extracted the consent of the broad masses, war for example, or because huge masses have passed suddenly from a state of political passivity to a certain activity, put forward demands which taken together, albeit not organically formulated, add to a revolution. Many empirical studies show that resistance to hegemony is indeed possible, as the dominated groups are rarely completely hegemonized. James Scott's work among peasantry in Sedaka shows that poor are not much mystified about the situation. He argues that the poor, when they may do so with relative safety, display an impressive capacity to penetrate behind the pieties and rationals of the rich farmers and to understand the larger realities of capital accumulation, proletarialization and marginalization, and within the narrow limits created by fear of repression and the dull compulsions of economic relations. They act to defend their interests by boycotts, quiet strikes, thefts and malicious gossips. The impact of Gramsci's work. Since his prison writings became widely known, Gramsci ideas have had huge impact within Marxism, cultural studies and in social sciences in general. Firstly, Gramsci's work has had a huge impact on Marxist theorizing. Marxist scholars including Althusser, Miliband, Polantas and Habermas and Marcuse have used Gramsci to study questions of power in modern society. For Bobbio, in Gramsci's work there is a double inversion in relation to Marxist tradition. One, the primacy of the ideological superstructure over the economic structure, and second, the primacy of civil society consensus over political society force. Gramsci is seen as the Marxist theorist whose principal contribution was to have broken with the economic determinism of Marx and the authoritarianism of Lenin, and to have insisted upon the role of human will and ideas. Gramsci also sought to re-establish the link between theory and practice lost in economic interpretations of Marxist thought, and thus to form an interpretation of historical materialism which would relocate it as mode of intervention in the course of historical political process. As a critique of class essentialism, hegemony also opened up the possibility of studying non-class forms of antagonism with the Marxist framework. It opens the possibility of considering other forms of social and cultural relationships, gender, race, sexuality, religion, environmentalism, and so on, as matters for analysis in their own right, but crucially does not do so by abandoning the questions of class. Pierre Bourdieu's exploration of taste and the emergence of new class groupings have shown to be invaluable additions to Gramsci's theory of hegemony. Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm also argues that the national question is in fact one of the areas where Marxist theory was most seriously lacking, and Gramsci's conception of the working class as part of the nation makes him the only Marxist thinker to provide us with the basis of integrating nation as a historical and social reality within Marxist theory. Gramsci's work had a huge impact on the formation of cultural studies in 1970s. Taking a Gramscian approach involves neither celebrating nor condemning popular texts. As Gramscian scholars ask, how could a popular film, song, or novel that simply reproduced the worldview of dominant social group ever hope to live in the imaginations of its subalterns? Criticism of Gramsci's work. Gramsci has been criticized by many orthodox Marxists for deviating from Marxist formulations. Marxist theorist Polontas critiques Gramsci's work for being historicist. He is highly suspicious of the privileged role that Gramsci's work apparently grants to consciousness. Polontas says that it is not the consciousness of the hegemonic class which secures the dominated class's active consent, but the social formation. For him, historicist Marxism is ultimately idealist in its assumption that ideas produce social and moral unity. Instead, the dominant ideology reflects that unity cannot therefore be some pure expression of the mindset of the ruling social group. Among other things, the dominant ideology is the outcome of unequal relationship between classes. Hence, he argues, we can understand not only why subaltern groups take on some of these ideas of the ruling class, but also why the discourse often presents elements borrowed from the ways of life other than that of the dominant class. Paul Gilroy argues that Gramsci is insufficiently critical of the concept of nationhood, the ways in which national identity is frequently saturated with racial connotations. He says that national popular projects can be typically ethnically exclusive. Therefore, to conclude, in this module we have seen how the Italian working class movement never took off. And according to Gramsci, the Russian Revolution became a success because it was a war of maneuver, and this happens very rarely. Whereas he talked about war of position, which was a strategy which took a very long time. And during this whole struggle, it is important to note that the state plays a very important role in hegemonizing, in creating consensus, in manufacturing consent of the ruled. And therefore, the rulers don't rule always through oppression, but through consensus. Thank you.